In 2017, Jordan Peele released his debut feature film Get Out, and it was an instant commercial and critical success, earning him an Academy Award for Best Original Screenplay. It's a script he famously said that he gave up writing 20 times, but let's have a look and see how he did write it.
Now you're in the sunken place.
Firstly, let's break down what the protagonist Chris wants and what's stopping him from achieving it. It's noted by Chris that this is his girlfriend Rosie's first interracial relationship. He's wanting to make sure her parents are aware of it so they aren't caught off guard by his appearance.
Do they know I'm black?
It's not as simple as Chris wanting Rosie's parents to like him. He doesn't want the weekend he's spending with them to be awkward.
He said I was the first black guy he ever dated.
Yeah, so what?
Yeah, so it's his uncharted territory for, I don't want to get chased off the lawn with a shotgun.
However, what's stopping Chris from achieving this is the fact that the Armitages have planned the whole weekend as a way of trapping Chris and auctioning him on his qualities off to the highest bidder. This is also a running theme throughout the film and something that is often related back to. We also need to figure out what's at stake in the story. So externally, Chris's relationship is what's at stake. It's something that can be gained or lost, and it's what he wants to keep a hold of throughout the film.
You're all I've got. I'm not gonna leave here without you. I'm not gonna abandon you, okay?
This is threatening when we realize that Rose was in on the plan the whole time.
You know I can't give you the keys, right, babe?
Internally, the stakes relate to Chris's mental strength and his struggle to be mentally strong and stable. This is jeopardised when Missy hypnotises Chris, as he's now vulnerable and susceptible to influence. Finally, the philosophical stakes aren't just what your character believes in, they can also be related to the underlying messages of your story. Here, their focus are on fighting against white domination over black people. Again, it's mentioned throughout the film in very subtle ways, but there are lots of references to this through the party guests' demeanour towards Chris and the family's use of Georgina and Walter. Once the stakes have been decided, we can now turn our attention to the key beats and see how the stakes fit into these and how they work together. The opening of Get Out sets the tone of the film from the off. It also bears a subplot which becomes relevant later, the kidnap of Andre Hayworth. People of colour are being targeted for kidnapping, and this theme is what the film revolves around, and it's nailed in this tense opening. So you'd write on your opening index card, Andre's kidnapping. It's also where the philosophical stakes of the story are introduced. Whilst Chris and Rose are on their way to Rose's parents' house, they hit a deer. This is a key catalyst for moving the story forward, as it first shows Rose is suspicious. She's seemingly protecting Chris from a police officer, but we later realise that by Chris not showing his ID to the officer, it hides the paper trail of Chris's whereabouts and who he is with. The catalyst is also the start point for the global problem in the story, which is Chris's mental strength. Seeing the injured deer laying on the side of the road brings back memories of what happened to Chris's mother when he was younger, and with the involvement he had in what led to her death.
You're so scared. You think it was your fault?
This is the moment in the story when the internal stakes are introduced. As the catalyst acts as the start point for the global problem in the story, the first act break is the start of the local problem, what needs to be resolved within the second act. This moment starts when Missy traps Chris in the sunken place.
Now you're in the sunken place.
She's manipulated him through hypnosis and reveals how subtly she can control Chris. This also becomes relevant later on as it helps with the Armitage's plan of trapping Chris. Chris is now under the control of Missy, and Chris's second act goal is fighting against the Armitage's control. This is also where the internal and philosophical stakes are threatened. When the party gets too much for Chris to deal with, he deflects a question towards the only other black person at the party, a familiar looking man who is going by the name of Logan King. Desperate to find an answer to why Chris finds this man familiar, he attempts to take a picture of Logan. The accidental flash on his camera triggers a response in Logan, forcing him to become agitated and repeatedly shouting "Get out" at Chris.
Get out! Yo! Shoot me! Get out! Shoot!
However, just a few minutes alone with Missy is enough to calm Logan down. The midpoint is where a reversal in the story happens. Chris is now suspicious of the family and their party guests, and Chris also sees it in a flaw within himself. He reveals that his mum survived the initial hit-and-run impact, but his delayed reaction to calling for help caused her to die.
There's nothing you could have done.
I found out later that She had survived the initial hit. She lay there bleeding by the side of the road, cold and alone. That's how she died in the early morning, cold and alone. And I was watching TV. There was time if somebody was looking for her. There was time. Nobody was looking.
The stakes have been deepened as Chris is suspicious of his relationship. Internally, he's struggling to cope with the reminder of his mother, and philosophically, black people are being targeted and dominated by white people. The local problem now needs to be solved at this point in the story, so Chris needs to learn how to block out the Armitage's control. The Armitage's true intentions are then revealed to Chris. This forces Chris to increase his mental strength to block out the influence of his captors. Chris has fought his way out of the Armitage's house. He used the Armitage's games against them and pretended to be under hypnosis. He stopped Missy from putting him back under, tried to save Georgina and saved Walter, albeit briefly, from being in the sunken place. He leaves Rose to die in the road as Rod turns up to save him. So in the end, Rod saves Chris. So here we have our first act. Again, we already have our opening, incited incident and first act break. We now need to bridge these gaps. We need Missy to trap Chris in the sunken place, but before that we need Chris and Russ to hit a deer on the way to her parents' house to unsettle Chris, making him more suggestible to Missy's influence. So after the opening, the first place to start would be to show Chris and Rose getting ready for their trip. We get to look around Chris's apartment and we see his photography skills and the artistry that he has. After this, Chris asks Rose if her parents know he's black. This is when the external stakes are established. It's relating to Chris's relationship with Rose and the fact he doesn't want his skin colour to come between them or make the weekend awkward. Whilst on the journey, Chris gets a cigarette out of his pocket. Rose throws it out of the window. Chris then gets a phone call and talks to his friend Rod. He says about not going to Rose's house.
You told mad at you because you never take my advice.
Like what?
Like don't go to a white girl parent's house.
After this, Chris and Rose hit the deer. It sets everything in motion for what will happen next. Whilst Rose deals with the police, Chris thinks about what he's just seen, mainly thinking back to his mother. The officer asks for Chris's ID. Rose confronts the officer and says that Chris doesn't need to show him his ID because he wasn't driving. It hides Chris's whereabouts by not showing his ID. Once they're back on the road, Chris and Rose arrive at the house. Chris sees the black groundskeeper Walter on their way up to the house. After they are greeted on the doorstep, the deer is brought up in conversation. Dean, Rose's father, mentions his stance on the deer. It's symbolism for his stance towards unwanted visitors and the power he has over being able to eradicate them. As well as the opening, this is also where the philosophical stakes are established. Chris then gets a tour of the house. He finds out about Rose's granddad losing out to Jesse Owens and how he never quite got over it. Chris then sees Georgina in the kitchen. Once outside, Dean justifies the use of the black servants in the house relating to Rose's grandma and granddad. After the tour, Dean and Missy get to know Chris. Chris mentions about his mum dying in a hit and run, and they also mention that Missy's hypnosis can cure nicotine addiction. Rose then realises that it's the family party this weekend. While serving drinks, Georgina zones out. At the family dinner, Chris notices Georgina looking odd while standing in the kitchen, similar to her behaviour earlier on in the day. Jeremy notes how he thinks Chris would be a beast at UFC if he trained his body properly. In the bedroom afterwards, Rose complains about her family's behaviour towards Chris. Chris tells Rose that he told her it would be awkward this weekend. That night, Chris has a nightmare about the deer. This causes Chris to wake up and wander around the house and grounds. Whilst outside, he sees Walter running and Georgina staring blankly out of the window. After being startled by Walter and Georgina, Chris heads back inside. Missy calls him and drags him into her office. She asks him about his mother, at which point Missy then hypnotises Chris. This has left Chris now trapped in the sunken place, and this now brings us to our first act break.
Now you're in the sunken place.
In the first half of the second act, we now need to build up to Logan having a reaction to Chris's flash. So after the hypnosis, Chris wakes up. The following morning, Chris is out taking pictures around the grounds. He sees Georgina acting weird again. Chris also goes over and talks to Walter. Walt has a strange vibe to him and doesn't speak like a person from the 21st century would. He also mentions that Chris was in Missy's office for a while last night.
And did it work?
Did what work?
You were in Mrs. Armitage's office for quite some time.
Oh, yeah.
Back inside the house, Chris mentions to Rose how Missy hypnotized him and he had some strange dreams. He also points out Walter's strange vibe. They look outside and see the party guests arriving. So once the party guests have arrived, they ask strange and personal questions to and about Chris.
Is it better?
Wow.
Whilst outside, Chris spots Logan. Chris approaches him to engage in conversation, but notices that Logan's behaviour is weird and not befitting of a man, again from the 21st century. Getting away from the crowd of the party, Chris speaks to a blind art dealer, Jim. Jim mentions how he's jealous of Chris's photographic ability. After the conversation, Chris heads inside. Once he heads upstairs, the guests stop their conversation and hear out for his footsteps. Chris sees that his phone has been unplugged and he has no battery left. He brings this to Rose's attention. Once his phone has been fully charged, Chris rings Rod and mentions Logan's strange behaviour. Rod jokingly mentions how the family are manipulating black people to control them.
And it's the black people out here too. It's like all of them miss the movement.
Because they probably hypnotized.
After the phone call, Georgina explains about his phone to Chris. Something about Georgina's behaviour unsettles Chris, and one of the questions Chris asks Georgina triggers a weird response within her.
If there's too many white people, I get nervous, you know?
When Chris returns to the party, he goes to take a picture of Logan. This also triggers a response, but this is a far more violent one.
Get out.
Sorry, man.
Okay.
Get out! Yo! Yo! Chill, man. Get out! Chill, man!
So the second half of the second act has begun, and it follows on from Logan's reaction to Chris trying to identify him. We're currently building up towards Chris's understanding of the Armitage's true intentions with him. It's explained to the party guests that Logan had a seizure. Chris and Rose go for a walk whilst Dean gets the party guests corralled. Across this next card, we intercut between Chris and Rose talking by the lake and an auction for Chris. Chris explains that he wants to leave the party, but most importantly, Jim buys Chris at the auction. Chris explains to Rose about his mother and his role in her death.
1 hour went by, then 2, and 3. And I just sat there. I was just watching TV.
He blames himself, which threatens the eternal stakes. They agree to go home. Chris and Rose head back to the house when they see the party guests are leaving. Chris sends the picture he took of Logan to Rod. Rod rings Chris and tells Chris that Logan is actually Andre Hayworth. Rod tells him to leave. Chris's phone then dies and he starts packing immediately.
We gotta go, right now.
Whilst packing, Chris finds pictures of Rose with loads of black people, including Georgina and Walter. Once downstairs, Chris is more demanding in his attempts to leave. Rose stalls and there's a slight scuffle between Chris, Dean and Jeremy, at which point Missy sends Chris back to the sunken place. Dean and Jeremy then carry Chris into the basement. Chris is now trapped back in the sunken place. Rod is trying to track Chris down. He finds out about Andre having been missing for several months. Chris wakes up in the basement. He's watching a TV screen which flickers into life, which is where Chris learns about what's going to happen to him through Rosie's grandfather's coagular video.
And if you're watching this, you're probably wondering what's going on. Well, there's no need to worry. Let's take a walk.
Rod goes to the police over his beliefs over what's been happening to Chris and Andre. He gets left out of the police station.
What's the next move?
Now, despite this being in the latter stages of the second act, this could be considered the moment of betrayal. The police force which should be there to protect Chris isn't taking his situation seriously. Rod returns home and tries to ring Chris again. Rose answers, and Rod speaks to Rose over Chris. He starts to get suspicious over her vague answers and tries to entrap her. She flips the conversation and makes Rod hang up. Chris speaks to Jim over what's going to happen to him during the procedure.
I'll control the motor function, so I'll be...
Me. You'll be me.
After the talk, Chris spots the cotton in the chair arms where he's been scratching away moments before the teacup appears on the TV screen again, which leads us into the third act where Chris needs to reverse his fortunes. And now we're into the third act. We're needing to bridge the gap between Chris finding out how to block the Armitage's control and his eventual escape from the Armitage household. Whilst Dean is prepping Jim for surgery, Jeremy goes to collect Chris. After getting unstrapped, Chris attacks Jeremy. We see this is where Chris put cotton in his ears to drown out the sound of the teacup. Dean gets impatient waiting for Jeremy and Chris, so he steps out into the hall to see what the holdup is. Chris then impales Dean on deer antlers, and a fire then breaks out in the surgery. Chris escapes upstairs and startles Georgina, who runs out of the kitchen. Chris grabs his phone and breaks Mrs. Teacup before she can reach for it. She stabs him in the hand, and he cuts her with the blade. Chris then arrives at the front door, but Jeremy stops Chris from leaving. Chris kills Jeremy and grabs his car keys. Meanwhile, all this is going on downstairs. Upstairs, Rose is looking for her next target. Chris leaves in Jeremy's car but hits Georgina on the way out. Chris then gets flashbacks to his mum and gets out to save Georgina. This is the moment of commitment for Chris as it stalls his eventual escape, leaving Rose to pursue him with a rifle. Whilst on the drive out, Georgina wakes up and she attacks Chris. This causes them to crash into a tree, and this is where Chris sees the scar around Georgina's head which her wig was concealing. Rose starts shooting. Walter chases after Chris and tackles him to the floor. This is when Chris flashes Walter. Walter grabs the gun off Rose. Walter shoots Rose before turning the gun on himself. Chris then pries the gun away from Rose. After crawling over to Rose, he goes to kill her when he sees the police turn up. Rose calls out for help. Chris knows that this doesn't look good as far as he's concerned and is ready to give himself up. This is the moment of despair for Chris as he's failed to save himself, failed to stop the Armitage influence over his life as Rose's cry for help will convince the police of Chris's guilt, and he's failed to overturn the flawed world where whites dominate over blacks, and the current crime scene he finds himself in will all but go against him. This is until Rod steps out of the police car.
Shit!
He went against the views of the police and instead chose to help Chris instead of ignoring the flawed situation where people of colour are being targeted and nothing is done about it.
I mean, I told you not to go in that house.
Chris has found the mental strength to outwit the Armitages and is no longer reliant on other people's control over him. He's lost his relationship but keeps his independence. I hope there was something to get out of this video. A lot of research and effort goes into making these videos, so any feedback or support is greatly appreciated. Like, share, comment and subscribe, but not necessarily in that order, and we'll see you next time.